The billionaire laughed so hard she nearly spilled her champagne. 7 days later, that laughter would be the only thing anyone remembered. The auction warehouse sat on the edge of Phoenix, Arizona, surrounded by chain-link fences, faded shipping containers, and rows of forgotten vehicles baking beneath the desert sun. Most people came there looking for bargains. A few came hunting for treasures. And then there was Ethan Walker, a struggling single dad who came because hope was cheaper than luck. At 42 years old, Ethan had learned that life rarely gave second chances. It gave bills. It gave broken water heaters. It gave school lunches to pay for and pickup trucks that refused to start on cold mornings. But every now and then, it gave something else. A small window, a crack in the wall, a possibility. That morning, he arrived in his aging Ford work truck with his 10-year-old daughter Sophie sitting beside him. She held a sketchbook on her lap and stared out the window as workers rolled vehicles across the lot. "Think we'll find anything good today, Dad?" she asked. Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "Depends on what you call good." Sophie grinned. "Something that doesn't look like it belongs in a junkyard. Then we're probably in the wrong place." They both laughed softly. It was the kind of laughter shared by people who didn't have much but still found reasons to smile. The warehouse buzzed with activity. Auctioneers shouted numbers. Buyers paced between rows of dusty vehicles. Engines occasionally coughed to life before falling silent again. The smell of motor oil lingered in the warm air. Ethan moved carefully through the crowd, studying each vehicle the way a doctor might examine patients in a waiting room. Most people saw rust. Ethan saw stories. He saw craftsmanship. He saw mistakes. He saw potential. Years before, he had worked as an engineer. Before layoffs. Before medical bills. Before life became a daily exercise in survival. Now he repaired old cars from a rented garage, taking whatever jobs he could find. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept food on the table. Near the center of the warehouse, a small crowd had gathered around a vehicle hidden beneath years of dust and neglect. The paint was faded. The tires were flat. One headlight hung slightly crooked. It looked forgotten, abandoned, worthless. A woman stood nearby, surrounded by assistants and security personnel. Her tailored white suit looked impossibly clean compared to everything around her. Her posture carried the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to owning rooms the moment she entered them. Victoria Sterling, billionaire investor, business magazine cover star, the kind of person whose decisions could move markets before lunch. An auction manager gestured toward the car. "Interesting piece, isn't it?" Victoria barely glanced at it. "Interesting," she repeated. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard." Several people chuckled. One of her advisors nodded eagerly. "Couldn't agree more." Victoria shook her head and laughed. "I've seen more value in a parking ticket." The crowd joined her. The laughter spread quickly. Ethan didn't laugh. Something about the car held his attention. Not the condition. Not the appearance. Something else. Something he couldn't immediately explain. Sophie noticed him staring. "What is it?" she whispered. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The afternoon sunlight filtered through high warehouse windows and landed across the vehicle's battered hood. For a brief moment, something caught the light beneath layers of dust. A detail so small nobody else seemed to notice it. Ethan took a slow breath. "Probably nothing," he said quietly. But he didn't sound convinced. Across the room, Victoria was already walking away, dismissing the vehicle with a wave of her hand as if its existence no longer deserved another second of her time. The crowd followed her. The laughter faded. The noise of the auction returned. Yet Ethan remained where he stood, unable to pull his eyes away. Somewhere deep inside, a feeling stirred. Not excitement. Not certainty. Just curiosity. The kind that changes lives when ignored and destroys comfort when followed. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the warehouse as bidding continued on other vehicles, but Ethan barely heard a word of it. His attention remained fixed on the neglected car, sitting alone beneath a thin layer of dust and years of indifference. Most people had already forgotten it existed. The crowd had moved on. Victoria Sterling had moved on. Even the auction staff seemed eager to push it aside and focus on more attractive inventory. Yet the feeling inside Ethan refused to leave. Sophie tilted her head and studied her father. She knew that look. It was the same expression he wore when repairing an engine that nobody else could diagnose. The same expression he had worn years ago when helping her build a science fair project from broken household parts. Quiet, focused, curious. You are doing it again, she said softly. Ethan glanced down. Doing what? The thing where you stare at something like it is talking to you. A faint smile crossed his face. Cars do talk. And what is this one saying? Ethan looked back toward the vehicle. I am not sure yet. The bidding eventually reached the abandoned car. The auctioneer's enthusiasm noticeably faded. He cleared his throat and read the description from a clipboard. A few people checked their phones. Others began walking toward the exit. The energy in the room disappeared almost instantly. Who wants to start us at $2,000? The auctioneer asked. Silence answered him. 1,000. More silence. A man near the back laughed. You would have to pay me to take it. Several people chuckled. Ethan watched carefully. The sunlight had shifted again. For a brief second, the same unusual reflection appeared near the front fender. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there. His pulse quickened. $500? The auctioneer asked. Nobody moved. Sophie looked up at her father. Dad. Ethan hesitated. Every dollar mattered. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. His garage needed repairs. His savings account barely deserved the name. Logic told him to walk away. Responsibility told him to walk away. Experience told him to walk away. But something else refused to let him. Slowly, he raised his hand. 500. The room turned toward him. A few eyebrows lifted. The auctioneer looked relieved. $500. Do I hear 6? Nobody answered. The silence stretched. Sold. The gavel struck. Just like that, the forgotten car belonged to Ethan Walker. As paperwork was completed, Victoria Sterling happened to pass nearby with 2 advisors following closely behind. One of them noticed Ethan signing the purchase documents. Looks like somebody bought the junk car. Victoria glanced over her shoulder. Her expression carried polite amusement. Good for him. She paused briefly. Hopefully he likes expensive mistakes. Then she continued walking without another thought. The comment was not cruel. It was worse. It was dismissive. Ethan said nothing. He had spent too many years being underestimated to take offense every time it happened. Still, Sophie heard it. Her small hand slipped into his. She does not know you, she whispered. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. No, she does not. They loaded the vehicle onto a borrowed trailer just before sunset. The Arizona sky glowed orange and gold above the distant mountains. Traffic hummed along the highway as they began the drive home. Most of the journey passed in comfortable silence. Sophie sketched in her notebook while Ethan replayed every detail he had noticed at the auction. The reflection, the unusual trim, the subtle differences hidden beneath years of wear. None of it made sense yet, but the pieces felt connected somehow. By the time they arrived at the garage, darkness had settled across the city. The building itself was modest. Peeling paint covered portions of the exterior walls. The neon sign above the entrance flickered occasionally when the weather changed. It was not impressive. It was not profitable, but it was theirs. Ethan unlocked the large bay door and slowly rolled the vehicle inside. The overhead lights buzzed to life one by one. Shadows stretched across concrete floors stained by decades of hard work. Sophie climbed down from the truck and stood beside her father. Together they looked at the car in silence. The warehouse noise was gone now. The laughter was gone. Victoria Sterling was gone. Only questions remained. Ethan grabbed a rag and carefully wiped away a patch of dust near the front quarter panel. The faded surface slowly emerged beneath his hand. Then he froze. Not because he had found an answer, because he had found another question. Hidden beneath layers of paint and time was a tiny marking. Almost invisible, deliberately covered. Sophie noticed his expression immediately. What is it? Ethan leaned closer. His heartbeat suddenly sounded very loud in the quiet garage. I do not know, he said. But somebody worked very hard to make sure nobody would ever notice it. For several long seconds, neither Ethan nor Sophie spoke. The garage felt strangely still, as if even the hum of the fluorescent lights had softened. Ethan ran his fingers across the tiny marking hidden beneath the paint. It was not a scratch. It was not accidental damage. It looked deliberate, purposeful, the kind of detail someone might spend hours hiding and years forgetting. Sophie stepped closer. Can you tell what it means? Ethan shook his head slowly. Not yet. He grabbed a flashlight from his workbench and angled the beam across the metal surface. The symbol appeared clearer under the light. Small, precise, almost elegant, yet oddly familiar. Somewhere deep in his memory, he felt he had seen it before. The problem was that he could not remember where. The clock on the wall crept past 9 in the evening. Sophie yawned and rubbed her eyes. Ethan noticed immediately. No matter how curious he felt, some responsibilities always came first. "Come on," he said gently. "School tomorrow." Sophie glanced reluctantly toward the office door. "You are staying, aren't you?" Ethan smiled. "Maybe for a little while." She pointed at him. "That means all night. Maybe half the night." "Dad," he laughed softly. "Go home. I promise I will sleep eventually." Sophie gave him a look that suggested she did not believe him at all. Then she wrapped her arms around him. "Do not work too hard." After she left, the garage became even quieter. Ethan sat alone beside the car. Outside, distant traffic rolled through the Phoenix night. Inside, only shadows and questions remained. He opened his laptop and began searching. Vintage manufacturer records, restoration forums, collector archives, automotive museums. Hours passed. One search became 10. 10 became 50. Midnight arrived unnoticed. Then 1:30. Then 2. Every lead seemed promising until it vanished into nothing. The symbol remained a mystery. Yet something else began to emerge. The vehicle identification number attached to the car appeared incomplete. Not altered. Not damaged. Just unusual. Certain records seemed missing. Entire sections of ownership history simply disappeared. Ethan leaned back in his chair. That bothered him more than the symbol itself. Cars always left footprints. Registrations. Insurance records. Maintenance histories. Ownership transfers. Vehicles collected stories whether they wanted to or not. This one seemed to have lost chapters. Entire chapters. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan found a reference buried inside an old collector discussion board. The conversation was nearly 15 years old. Most of the links were broken. Half the images no longer loaded. Yet one comment caught his attention. A retired restoration expert had mentioned a small production run connected to a confidential engineering project decades earlier. The comment included a blurry photograph. Ethan stared at the screen. Then he looked at the symbol on the car. Then back at the photograph. His heartbeat quickened. They were not identical. But they were close. Very close. He sat forward. Suddenly exhausted eyes became alert. He clicked every available link. Most led nowhere. One redirected to a private collector archive that required membership access. Another referenced a man named Richard Hayes. Ethan recognized the name immediately. Anyone involved in rare automobiles knew Richard Hayes. He was considered one of the most respected appraisal experts in America. His opinion could elevate a forgotten vehicle into a museum piece or reduce an alleged treasure to an expensive disappointment. Ethan looked at the clock again. 3:15 in the morning. Calling Richard Hayes was impossible. Besides, what would he even say? "Hello, I bought a neglected car for $500 and found a strange symbol under old paint. Can you solve my mystery?" It sounded ridiculous, even to him. Yet the feeling would not leave. The same feeling that had followed him since the auction. The same quiet voice telling him there was more here than anyone realized. By sunrise, Ethan finally locked the garage and headed home. He slept less than 2 hours before Sophie woke him for school. As they ate breakfast, she watched him carefully. "You found something." Ethan paused. "Maybe. That means yes." He smiled. "It means I found enough to ask better questions." Sophie grinned. "That sounds like one of your dad's speeches." "Probably because I am a dad." Later that afternoon, after dropping Sophie at a friend's house, Ethan returned to the garage carrying fresh coffee and a notebook filled with observations. Determination replaced exhaustion. He began carefully removing more layers of paint around the hidden marking, inch by inch, patiently, respectfully, as though uncovering history itself. Then the phone rang. Ethan almost ignored it. Almost. The number was unfamiliar. He answered anyway. A calm professional voice greeted him. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan frowned. "Yes." There was a brief pause. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I represent Sterling Capital." Ethan's expression changed instantly. "Sterling Capital. Victoria Sterling's company." The voice continued. "I understand you recently purchased a certain vehicle at auction. We would like to discuss the possibility of acquiring it from you." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the partially stripped panel while the voice on the phone waited patiently. The garage suddenly felt smaller, quieter, more watchful. "You want to buy the car?" Ethan finally asked. "That is correct, Mr. Walker," Daniel Mercer replied. "Miss Sterling understands you recently acquired the vehicle and would like to make a fair offer. Ethan looked across the garage toward the neglected machine sitting beneath the fluorescent lights. 24 hours earlier, nobody had wanted it. Now a representative from one of the wealthiest companies in America was calling to purchase it. The timing felt wrong. Too sudden. Too convenient. How much? Ethan asked. There was a brief pause. $5,000. Ethan almost laughed. Not because it was a bad offer. Compared to the $500 he had paid, it was extraordinary. 10 times his investment in less than a day. For many people, the decision would have been immediate. I appreciate the offer, Ethan said carefully. But I think I am going to hold on to it for now. Another pause. Longer this time. May I ask why? Ethan glanced again at the exposed marking beneath the paint. Because I do not think I know what I have yet. The professional tone remained calm. Understood. Should you change your mind, Sterling Capital would be happy to continue discussions. The call ended politely. No pressure. No threats. No demands. Yet Ethan stood motionless for several seconds after hanging up. The conversation left behind more questions than answers. Wealthy people did not chase worthless cars. They especially did not send representatives within hours of an auction. Somewhere, someone knew something. The problem was figuring out what. That evening, Sophie returned to the garage carrying 2 cheeseburgers and a milkshake balanced carefully in her hands. She spotted Ethan staring at the vehicle. You got that look again. Ethan accepted the food with a grateful smile. What look? The one that says your brain forgot how to rest. He laughed softly. Fair observation. As they sat together on old folding chairs, Ethan told her about the phone call. Sophie's eyes widened. $5,000? That was the offer. And you said no? I did. Sophie chewed thoughtfully. Good. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You did not even think about it. Neither did you. He smiled. Children often saw things adults complicated. To Sophie, the situation was simple. If someone suddenly wanted something that badly, there was usually a reason. Outside, evening settled across Phoenix. The desert sky turned shades of purple and gold. Inside the garage, Ethan returned to work. He carefully removed another thin layer of paint around the mysterious symbol. More details began emerging. Tiny manufacturing marks. Unusual serial stamps. Features that did not appear on any standard production records he could find. The deeper he looked, the stranger the story became. Around 8 o'clock, an email notification appeared on his laptop. Ethan opened it immediately. His breath caught. It was a reply from the collector archive he had contacted earlier that morning. The message was brief, professional, direct. Most importantly, it included a name. Richard Hayes. The expert himself had agreed to review photographs of the vehicle. Ethan spent the next hour taking careful pictures from every angle imaginable. The symbol, the identification numbers, the hidden markings. Every detail received attention. Once finished, he sent the files and waited. The waiting proved harder than the work. Hours passed. Midnight approached. No reply arrived. Eventually, Ethan locked the garage and drove home. Sleep came reluctantly. Questions followed him into the darkness. By morning, nothing had changed. No email. No phone call. No answers. He dropped Sophie at school and headed toward a repair job across town. Life still demanded attention. Customers still needed vehicles repaired. Bills still arrived on schedule. Yet throughout the day, his thoughts kept drifting back to the garage. Back to the symbol. Back to Victoria Sterling's sudden interest. By late afternoon, rain clouds gathered unexpectedly over the city. Rare for Arizona. Heavy gray skies stretched across the horizon. Ethan was finishing an oil change when his phone vibrated. He checked the screen. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. Walker? The voice sounded older this time. Slower. Measured. This is Richard Hayes. Ethan straightened immediately. Mr. Hayes. Thank you for calling. I reviewed the photographs you sent. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Careful silence. The kind that appears before important words. Ethan waited. Tell me something, Richard said. Where exactly did you find this vehicle? Ethan explained the auction. The abandoned condition. The low price. The laughter from the crowd. Richard listened without interruption. When Ethan finished, the older man exhaled slowly. Interesting. What is? Richard paused again. Mr. Walker, I believe that car deserves a closer examination. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Because it is valuable? Another pause. Longer this time. No, Richard said quietly. Because I am not entirely sure it is the car everyone thinks it is. The line went quiet after Richard Hayes spoke those words. Ethan stood beside a customer vehicle with a wrench still in his hand, staring through the open garage door as dark rain clouds drifted across the Arizona sky. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Richard's voice remained calm. "I mean, there are details in those photographs that do not align with the production records attached to that vehicle identification number." Ethan leaned against the workbench. "Are you saying somebody changed it?" "I am saying I do not know. Yet." The answer somehow felt more unsettling than certainty. Richard continued. "There are manufacturing marks that should not exist together. Certain components appear original. Others suggest a completely different history. I would like to examine it personally." Ethan swallowed. "How soon?" "Tomorrow morning." After ending the call, Ethan remained motionless for several moments. The sounds of the repair shop returned slowly around him. Tools clinking, air compressors humming, tires rolling across concrete floors. Ordinary noises from an ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The mysterious car was beginning to pull him into a world he did not fully understand. By the time he picked Sophie up from school, the rain had started. Tiny drops tapped against the windshield as traffic crawled through evening streets. Sophie immediately noticed the change in her father's expression. "What happened?" she asked. Ethan told her about Richard Hayes. Every word, every detail, every unanswered question. Sophie listened carefully. When he finished, she stared out the side window. "So now a famous expert wants to see the car." "Yes. And the billionaire wants to buy it." "Apparently." She nodded thoughtfully. "That seems suspicious." Ethan laughed despite himself. "That is one word for it." Later that evening, they returned to the garage together. Neither one mentioned dinner. Neither one seemed interested in leaving. The car sat exactly where they had left it. Quiet, patient, almost as if it knew it was being discussed. Ethan walked around it slowly. For the first time, he tried to imagine the possibility that Richard Hayes might be wrong. Maybe this entire thing was a misunderstanding. Maybe curiosity had created patterns where none existed. Maybe he was chasing a fantasy because life had not offered many reasons to dream lately. The thought lingered longer than he expected. What if he was wrong? The question followed him everywhere. What if he invested time, money, and hope into something that turned out to be worthless? What if Victoria Sterling's offer had actually been generous? What if he was risking stability for an illusion? Sophie interrupted his thoughts. She had climbed onto a stool near the workbench and was sketching in her notebook again. "Can I ask something?" she said. "Of course. If the car turns out to be nothing special, will you regret buying it?" Ethan considered the question carefully. Outside, rain tapped softly against the roof. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast long reflections across the worn body panels. "No," he finally said. Sophie looked surprised. "Why not?" Ethan smiled. "Because for the first time in a long time, I am curious about something again." Sophie returned to her drawing with a small grin. "That sounds like another dad speech." "Probably." The evening passed quietly. Ethan organized photographs and notes for Richard Hayes. He documented every hidden marking he had discovered, every unusual component, every discrepancy. Around 9 o'clock, his email chimed. A new message appeared from Sterling Capital. This one was shorter than the first, more direct. "Mr. Walker, our client remains interested in acquiring the vehicle. Should you reconsider, we are prepared to increase our offer substantially." Ethan read the message twice. No number was listed. No details. Just a suggestion. Substantially. He closed the laptop slowly. The pressure was growing. Not openly. Not aggressively. Just enough to be noticed. Sophie saw his expression. "More money." Ethan nodded. "They did not say how much." "That means a lot." "Maybe." Sophie tapped her pencil against the notebook. "Dad." "Yes." "People usually do not offer more money for things they do not care about." Ethan stared toward the car again. Children had a way of reducing complicated situations into simple truths. The rain continued through most of the night. Long after Sophie fell asleep on the office couch, Ethan remained awake. He sat alone beside the vehicle, reviewing photographs and records one final time before Richard Hayes arrived. Midnight came and went. Then 1 in the morning. The garage felt almost sacred in its silence. A place suspended between answers and uncertainty. Finally, exhaustion won. Ethan drifted into a shallow sleep in a folding chair near the workbench. He woke before sunrise to the sound of tires crunching across wet gravel outside. Headlights swept briefly across the garage windows. A vehicle had arrived. Ethan stood immediately. His pulse quickened. Through the glass, he saw an older black SUV pull into the parking lot. The driver's door opened. A tall, gray-haired man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio case. Richard Hayes had come in person, but as Ethan moved toward the entrance, another set of headlights appeared at the far end of the lot. Then another, and another. 3 luxury vehicles rolled slowly into view and parked near the street. Ethan stopped. Something about their timing felt impossible to ignore. Richard Hayes glanced toward the arriving cars and frowned slightly. Then he looked back at Ethan. "Tell me," he said quietly, "have you informed anyone else about what you found?" Ethan followed Richard Hayes's gaze toward the row of luxury vehicles parked near the edge of the lot. Their engines had gone silent, but their presence seemed to fill the damp morning air. The rain had stopped before sunrise, leaving the asphalt dark and reflective beneath a blanket of low gray clouds. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ethan shook his head. "No, I told my daughter." "And you?" Richard studied him carefully. The older man's expression remained calm, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Interesting," he said quietly. One of the luxury car doors opened. A man in a tailored navy suit stepped out. Not threatening, not aggressive, just professional. The kind of person who looked more comfortable inside boardrooms than parking lots. He walked toward them with measured confidence. Richard watched him approach. "Let me guess," he said. "Sterling Capital." Ethan nodded slowly. The suited man offered a polite smile as he arrived. "Mr. Walker. Good morning." Ethan recognized the voice immediately. Daniel Mercer, the representative who had called him twice already. Daniel glanced toward Richard Hayes and extended his hand. "Mr. Hayes, an honor." Richard shook it briefly. "Mr. Mercer." The exchange remained cordial, but the atmosphere shifted. Like 2 experienced chess players recognizing the board before the first move. Daniel turned back to Ethan. "I apologize for arriving unannounced." "Do you?" Ethan asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Fair point." He looked toward the car inside the garage. "Our client remains interested." Richard folded his arms. "Your client seems unusually interested." Daniel chose his words carefully. "Miss Sterling believes opportunities should be pursued when they appear." Richard did not reply. Neither did Ethan. The silence stretched. Finally, Daniel reached inside his jacket and produced a sealed envelope. A revised offer. Ethan stared at it without taking it. "You still have not told me why." Daniel hesitated. Just enough for Ethan to notice. "Because my client believes the vehicle may possess historical significance." Historical significance. The phrase lingered in the air. Not valuable. Not rare. Historical. Richard's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Ethan finally accepted the envelope. Inside was a formal purchase proposal. His breath caught. The new offer exceeded anything he had expected. It was enough to erase debts. Enough to secure Sophie's future. Enough to transform his life overnight. For several seconds, he simply stared at the number. Daniel noticed. "It is a generous offer." Ethan looked up. "For a car everyone called worthless 2 days ago?" Daniel remained silent. Richard remained silent. Sometimes silence revealed more than answers. Sophie arrived 20 minutes later carrying 2 cups of coffee and a bag of pastries. She immediately sensed the tension. Children often noticed emotional weather long before adults acknowledged it. Ethan explained the situation as simply as possible. Sophie listened. Then she looked toward the envelope. Then toward the car. Then back toward her father. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Ethan did not answer immediately, because he honestly did not know. The offer represented security, stability, a chance to stop worrying about every unexpected bill. Yet every instinct told him something remained hidden beneath the surface. Something nobody was saying. Richard eventually stepped inside the garage and began examining the vehicle. Hours passed. He measured components, studied weld patterns, compared serial markings against old reference materials stored inside his portfolio. Occasionally, he would pause and simply stare at a particular detail without speaking. Ethan tried to read his reactions. It was impossible. The older expert revealed nothing. By early afternoon, the garage had become strangely busy. 2 local collectors stopped by after hearing rumors. Then another. Then a journalist from an automotive website called asking questions. Information was spreading. Nobody seemed entirely sure what they were discussing. Yet curiosity had taken on a life of its own. Sophie sat quietly near the office window, watching people come and go. "Dad," she said softly. Ethan looked up from his workbench. "Yes. Remember when everyone laughed?" He nodded. "I remember." She looked toward the growing crowd outside. "They are not laughing anymore." Ethan followed her gaze. She was right. The laughter from the auction felt very far away now. Late that afternoon, Richard finally removed his glasses and sat heavily in a chair. For the first time all day, he looked tired. Not confused. Not uncertain. Just thoughtful. Ethan approached carefully. "Did you find something?" Richard stared at the vehicle for several long seconds before answering. Outside, the clouds had begun to break apart. Shafts of sunlight stretched across the wet parking lot. The garage felt suspended between questions and revelations. Finally, Richard nodded once. Slowly, deliberately. "Yes." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What?" Richard looked directly at him. "I found enough to know that this story is far bigger than a rare automobile." Before Ethan could respond, Daniel Mercer's phone rang. The Sterling representative glanced at the screen. His expression changed instantly. The confidence disappeared, replaced by concern. He answered immediately, listened, said almost nothing, then ended the call. Richard noticed. Ethan noticed. Even Sophie noticed. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the vehicle. For the first time since arriving, he no longer appeared calm. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "I think there is someone you need to meet." The words hung in the air long after Daniel Mercer spoke them. Nobody moved immediately. Even the sounds from outside seemed distant for a moment. Ethan looked from Daniel to Richard Hayes, searching for some clue that would explain what was happening. Instead, he found only silence. The careful kind. The kind people use when they know more than they are ready to say. "Who?" Ethan finally asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Miss Sterling." Sophie blinked. "The billionaire?" Daniel nodded. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying him closely. Interesting timing. Daniel did not argue. He simply looked toward Ethan. "She is already on her way." The statement landed with surprising weight. 2 days ago, Victoria Sterling had dismissed the vehicle with a laugh and walked away. Now she was personally driving across the city to see it. Ethan folded his arms. "Why?" Daniel hesitated again. "Because certain information became available this afternoon." "What information?" Daniel offered a polite smile. "I think Miss Sterling would prefer to explain that herself." Ethan almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because every answer seemed to create 3 more questions. The afternoon drifted toward evening. News of the mysterious vehicle continued spreading faster than anyone expected. Local automotive forums exploded with speculation. Photographs appeared online. Amateur experts debated theories. Some claimed the car was a forgotten prototype. Others insisted it was a fabrication. A few suggested it might be connected to a famous collector who vanished from public life decades earlier. Nobody knew the truth, yet everyone suddenly wanted to be part of the conversation. By sunset, several reporters had appeared outside the garage. They remained respectful, but their presence transformed the quiet property into something it had never been before. Ethan's little repair shop had become the center of a mystery. Sophie sat near the office window, watching people gather beyond the fence. "This is weird," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Very. Are you scared?" The question surprised him. He thought about it carefully before answering. "Not scared." "Then what?" Ethan looked toward the vehicle, toward the hidden markings, toward the growing crowd outside. "Responsible." Sophie tilted her head. "For what?" Ethan smiled faintly. "For making sure I do not rush into the wrong decision." Sophie seemed satisfied with that answer. Richard Hayes spent most of the evening reviewing old records on his laptop. Occasionally, he would stop and compare something on the screen to a detail hidden beneath the vehicle's weathered paint. Each comparison seemed to deepen his concentration, yet he still refused to reveal his conclusions. Shortly after 7 o'clock, a black sedan entered the parking lot. The crowd outside immediately noticed. Conversations stopped. Cameras lifted. Heads turned. The vehicle rolled slowly toward the garage entrance and came to a stop. For several seconds, nobody emerged. Then the rear passenger door opened. Victoria Sterling stepped out. Unlike the auction, there were no assistants surrounding her. No photographers. No security team hovering nearby. Just Victoria herself. Her expression was calm, but not relaxed. Focused. Intentional. She walked toward the garage entrance while reporters called out questions from behind the fence. She ignored every one of them. Ethan watched her approach. It struck him how different she seemed from the woman who had laughed at the auction. The confidence remained. The composure remained. But the amusement was gone. Victoria stopped several feet from the vehicle and looked at it in complete silence. Not for seconds. For nearly a full minute. Nobody interrupted. Finally she spoke. "It really is here." Richard Hayes exchanged a glance with Ethan. Victoria stepped closer. Her eyes moved carefully across the body panels. The hidden markings. The areas Ethan had uncovered. She seemed less interested in the car's condition than its identity. "Miss Sterling," Ethan said. "You wanted to see me?" Victoria nodded slowly. "Actually, Mr. Walker, I wanted to see this." She rested her gaze on the vehicle. Then something unexpected happened. Her expression softened. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal something human beneath the billionaire image the world knew. Memory. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Sophie noticed it immediately. Children often noticed what adults overlooked. Victoria eventually turned toward Ethan. "I owe you an apology." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Richard Hayes looked genuinely surprised. Even Daniel Mercer appeared caught off guard. Victoria continued. "At the auction, I dismissed something I should not have dismissed." Ethan studied her carefully. "The car." Victoria looked back toward the vehicle. Not just the car. Silence followed. Outside, the last sunlight faded from the horizon. Inside the garage, the fluorescent lights cast long reflections across metal and concrete. The atmosphere felt different now. Less like a negotiation. More like the beginning of a confession. Victoria slowly reached into her purse and removed an old photograph. The edges were worn. The colors faded by time. She handed it to Ethan. He looked down. His breath caught. The photograph showed a much younger Victoria standing beside a vehicle. Not a similar vehicle. The same one. Or at least what appeared to be the same one. Ethan looked up immediately. Victoria's eyes met his. Calm. Serious. Certain. "Mr. Walker," she said quietly, "before anyone talks about offers or auctions or value, there is something you need to understand. This car disappeared nearly 20 years ago." The garage fell silent after Victoria Sterling spoke. Even the reporters outside seemed quieter somehow, as though the weight of her words had traveled through the walls. Ethan looked down at the faded photograph again. The younger version of Victoria stood beside the vehicle with one hand resting on the hood. She looked happy. Not wealthy. Not powerful. Just happy. It was a version of her that seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman standing before him now. "What do you mean it disappeared?" Ethan asked. Victoria folded her arms and stared at the photograph for a long moment. "I mean exactly that. One day it was there, then it was gone." Richard Hayes remained seated, listening carefully. Daniel Mercer stood near the garage entrance, unusually quiet. Sophie had moved closer to her father without realizing it. Victoria continued. "Most people think money solves every problem. It does not. 20 years ago, my father spent years searching for that car. Private investigators. Collectors. Auctions. Registries. Nothing." Her voice softened slightly. Eventually, everyone assumed it had been destroyed. Ethan glanced toward the vehicle. Suddenly, the rust and faded paint seemed less important than the years hidden beneath them. Why was it so important? Victoria smiled faintly. It was not a smile of confidence. It was a smile of memory. Because it was the last thing he built before everything changed. Richard Hayes slowly removed his glasses. The gesture alone told Ethan how significant that statement was. Victoria noticed. "You know the story." Richard nodded. "Part of it. Then you understand." Richard looked toward the car. "More than I did yesterday." The room grew quiet again. Outside, the last traces of daylight vanished completely. The garage lights reflected softly against the vehicle's weathered body. It no longer looked abandoned. It looked patient, as if it had been waiting for someone to uncover its story. Victoria stepped closer to the car and gently touched one of the exposed panels. "My father always believed that real value was invisible at first." Ethan remembered the laughter at the auction, the dismissive comments, the certainty with which everyone had judged the vehicle. The memory felt strangely distant now. "Then why did you call it worthless?" he asked. Victoria's hand stopped moving. The question lingered between them. She looked down for a moment before answering. "Because I thought it was something else." There was honesty in her voice. Not pride. Not excuses. Just honesty. "I saw what everyone else saw. Dust. Rust. Neglect. I made the same mistake they did. Sophie looked at her curiously. So you were wrong. Victoria surprised everyone by smiling. Yes, I was. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Richard Hayes stood and walked toward a workbench covered with documents. He carefully unfolded several old records he had been studying all afternoon. The problem, he said quietly, is that this story is no longer just about finding a lost car. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Richard pointed towards several matching identification markings. The deeper I look, the less sense the official history makes. Victoria nodded slowly. That is what worried me. Ethan looked between them. What are you not saying? Richard hesitated. Not because he wanted to create suspense. Because he was choosing his words carefully. There are people who have spent decades believing this vehicle no longer existed. Ethan frowned. And Richard met his eyes. People tend to react strongly when assumptions worth millions of dollars suddenly change. The statement settled heavily over the room. Daniel Mercer shifted uncomfortably. Victoria remained silent. Outside, several reporters were still gathered near the fence, their camera lights occasionally flashing through the darkness. The attention surrounding the vehicle was growing by the hour. So was the pressure. Ethan suddenly understood something he had not considered before. This was no longer just his discovery. Too many people were involved now. Collectors, corporations, journalists, experts. Everyone wanted something. Answers, ownership, recognition, money. Yet only one person had actually seen the value when nobody else cared. Ethan thought about the auction, the laughter, the $500 bid, the risk he almost did not take. Sophie gently squeezed his arm. It was such a small gesture, yet it grounded him immediately. Richard gathered the documents into a neat stack. Tomorrow morning, there is a collector's auction in Scottsdale. Victoria nodded. Daniel nodded. Even Ethan recognized the event. It was one of the most respected automotive auctions in the country. Richard looked directly at Ethan. If the evidence continues pointing where I think it is pointing, that vehicle belongs there. Ethan stared at him. You want me to auction it? Richard's expression remained calm. I want the truth examined publicly. Victoria slowly exhaled. For the first time all evening, she seemed genuinely uncertain. And if the truth is what we think it is? Richard looked toward the car, then toward Ethan, then toward the faded photograph resting on the workbench. Then tomorrow, he said quietly, a lot of very important people are going to discover how wrong they have been. The next morning arrived beneath a clear Arizona sky washed clean by the previous day's rain. The Scottsdale auction hall buzzed with anticipation long before the doors officially opened. Collectors, journalists, historians, investors, and enthusiasts filled the building with the restless energy that always appeared when something rare was about to happen. Yet even among all the polished luxury vehicles and multi-million-dollar collections, one car attracted more attention than all the others combined. Ethan stood quietly beside Sophie near the edge of the exhibition floor. He wore the same modest jacket he had worn to countless repair jobs. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing suggested importance. Yet people who had never noticed him before now watched him with curiosity and respect. Sophie squeezed his hand. You okay? Ethan smiled softly. I think so. The truth was he felt strangely calm. The uncertainty that had followed him for days was gone. Whatever happened next, the story was no longer hidden. Richard Hayes stepped onto the presentation stage shortly before noon. The room gradually settled into silence. Hundreds of conversations faded into whispers and then disappeared entirely. Richard adjusted the microphone and looked out across the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, sometimes history hides in plain sight. The giant screens behind him illuminated with photographs of the vehicle. Original records, manufacturing documents, historical images. The faded photograph Victoria Sterling had carried for years. Richard carefully walked the audience through every discovery. The hidden markings, the altered records, the missing ownership trail. Piece by piece, the mystery unfolded. Then came the final revelation. The vehicle was not merely rare. It was the only surviving prototype from a revolutionary engineering project created by Victoria Sterling's father decades earlier. A project abandoned before public release. A vehicle believed destroyed. A machine that represented not just innovation, but the final dream of a man whose life changed shortly afterward. The room remained completely silent. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of realization. The silence that appears when people understand they are witnessing something extraordinary. Ethan glanced toward Victoria. She sat motionless in the front row, her eyes fixed on the screen displaying the old photograph. Richard continued. For 20 years, collectors searched for this vehicle. Corporations searched for it. Historians searched for it. They looked in museums, warehouses, private collections, and forgotten archives. Nobody found it. He paused, then smiled faintly. Because nobody was looking in the right place. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the audience. Richard turned toward Ethan. It was not discovered by an expert. It was not discovered by a billionaire. It was not discovered by a corporation. It was discovered by a single father who saw value where everyone else saw junk. Every eye in the room turned toward Ethan. He immediately looked uncomfortable. Sophie looked proud enough for both of them. Applause began somewhere near the back of the room. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall stood and applauded. Ethan lowered his eyes. Not because he was embarrassed. Because moments like this had never been why he took the risk. He had simply followed curiosity. Followed instinct. Followed a quiet voice that refused to ignore what others overlooked. When the auction finally began, the bidding moved faster than anyone expected. Numbers climbed with astonishing speed. $1 million. $2 million. $4 million. $6 million. The room watched in disbelief as offers continued rising. Victoria remained silent throughout the process. She never placed a bid. She simply watched. The amount eventually crossed $10 million. Gasps echoed through the hall. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Yet Ethan barely heard any of it. His attention remained on Sophie. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Not because of the money. Because she understood what had really happened. The world had finally seen what she already knew about her father. The auction ended. The final number appeared on the screen. Applause filled the hall once more. But the most important moment came afterward. Victoria approached Ethan quietly while the crowd celebrated around them. For a second, neither spoke. Then she extended her hand. Congratulations. Ethan shook it. Thank you. Victoria smiled. A genuine smile this time. My father used to say that character is the ability to recognize value before anyone else does. She glanced toward the vehicle one last time. I think he would have liked you. Ethan looked at the photograph she still carried. I think he would have been happy his dream was found. Victoria nodded slowly. So do I. Later that evening, after the cameras were gone and the crowd had disappeared, Ethan and Sophie sat outside their garage watching the sunset paint the desert sky gold and crimson. The world around them felt quieter now. Simpler. The money would change their lives. But it was not the part Ethan would remember most. What he would remember was the lesson hidden inside an old forgotten car. The lesson that value is not determined by the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes the world laughs because it cannot see clearly. Sometimes people overlook what matters because they are moving too fast. And sometimes the greatest treasures reveal themselves only to those willing to look a little longer. Sophie rested her head on his shoulder. The evening breeze moved gently through the air. Neither felt the need to say much. Some victories arrive with noise. The best ones arrive with peace. And if this story reminded you that dignity, patience, and quiet faith still matter in a world that often judges too quickly, share where you are watching from and tell us what part stayed with you the most. And if stories about second chances, hidden value, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things speak to your heart, we would be honored to have you join us again for the next journey.